Tories supported the war for the most part. Tony Blair supported the war. Tony Blair got into a lot of trouble, but it seems to be not about the war, but about whether he, in what he said, misled the country?
That's entirely right. I think there was broad support for the war. I mean, he was always in a very secure position because the Conservative Party, the principal opposition party, supported the war and supported the Prime Minister in going to war. So the opposition to Tony Blair is not because of his support for the United States, emphatically not. It is not really for his support for the war. Again, that is not the point at issue. The point at issue is whereas a fairly broad-ranging case for the war was put in the United States, a whole series of different reasons for going to war. In the United Kingdom, it was predominantly because there were, it was said, as a matter of fact, weapons of mass destruction. And secondly, that these weapons of mass destruction were a positive danger to the United Kingdom. At one stage, just before a crucial parliamentary vote, there were stories that the Iraqis could hit the United Kingdom in 45 minutes. Well, that was patent nonsense. It was always patent nonsense. Everybody knew it was patent nonsense who'd been anywhere near government. Government didn't correct that. They had 100 opportunities to say, no, 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 this is a mistake. They didn't do so. And subsequently, of course, when it has become apparent to the whole country that that was nonsense, there's been a great deal of concern about the information they were given in the lead up to the war. The assumption, I think, by everybody was that the Prime Minister knew more about weapons of mass destruction than he was able to say.
Meaning what? That he knew that they were not there?
No, 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 no. That he had information that made it clear they were there, that for security reasons he couldn't divulge.
Right.
That's what most people thought, that the information was better than he was...
At the time.
At the time. That the information was better, that they had weapons of mass destruction, than he was able to say. That was the predominant view.
And that's a view he wanted them to believe?
Well, I can't, you misjudge his motives, I can't do that. But what became apparent afterwards, not that he had more information saying that the weapons of mass destruction were there, but that he had less. And the combination of that and the enormous disillusionment over the 45-minute claim has led people to wonder at the information they were given in the run-up to the war. So emphatically, the concern that people have with the Prime Minister about that is not an anti-American feeling.
But can Howard make that point and gain from that point?
Well, I think he is making that point, but the election's about a good deal more than that. I don't think Michael Howard has to make that point. The election's
just there.
It's there. It's there. And this election is about the next 5 years. It's not necessarily about the last 5 years. So I think Michael Howard is right to talk about the things that are going to matter in the future, like pensions, like health, like education, like taxation.
Is there a risk that we're rather missing the whole point here, that actually members of the public will be saying, oh, for goodness sake, it doesn't really matter what you do to the House of Commons, we're just sick of politics, we're sick of the political class, we're sick of people who feather their own nests,
yes,
and that fundamental deep feeling, if it exists, actually can't be quickly reduced?
Nothing can be done quickly, but there are two things that stand out. One is the extent to which the public sees what politicians, leading politicians, say as being the product of PR, of people who are spinning the outcome, not the actual facts, not the truth. And I have to say, feeding into that has been undoubtedly the growing revelations about the way in which we got into the Iraq War, which many people feel now was not only illegitimate, but in some senses almost immoral.
Sir John?
Well, I agree with that. I think there are a number of things that have come together over recent years to destroy trust in Parliament, and I think the largest elephant in the room is undoubtedly the concerns about the Iraq War. I think there are others. I think most of the people listening to this programme are sick of change. I think they would like a degree of stability, but I think there's other things they don't like as well. Shirley talked about spinning. I think that is a real problem. There are two sorts of political advisers. There are those who advise on policy, and there are those whose job is to exercise the black arts. Frankly, I would like to get rid of all of those who exercise the black arts. They do no good to the quality of Parliament. What they say is often questionable, if not downright dishonest. And I think the sooner that sort of element of politics disappears, the sooner the public will be able to take at face value what governments and others say. So I think that trust point is very relevant. But Iraq is becoming a bigger issue. Were there weapons of mass destruction? I supported the Iraq War because I believed what the Prime Minister said.
I had myself been Prime Minister in the first Gulf War, and I knew that when I said something, I was utterly certain that it was correct, and I said less than I know. I assumed the same thing had happened, and on that basis I supported reluctantly the Second Iraq War. It now seems, listening to the Chilcot Inquiry, which is proving more fascinating by the day, that there were questions about whether there were weapons of mass destruction. In which case, obvious points arise. Why was the matter not referred back to Hans Blix to take a longer look before we engaged in a war? Why did nobody go back to the United Nations seeking a proper resolution? Did the Cabinet know that there were doubts about whether there were weapons of mass destruction? The suspicion arises that this was more about regime change than it was about weapons of mass destruction. And there is a bit of history here which I'm not sure that many people have yet heard. When President Clinton was in office, America passed an act called the Iraq Liberation Act, which committed the US to regime change long before President Bush actually came into power. We, of course, had no comparative law in this country. Sometime, I think in the mid-90s, officials, not President Clinton, officials approached the UK to discuss ideas about regime change. And my officials at the time replied that, of course, Saddam is a bad man and we need to get rid of him. But that isn't the most important point. It has to be legal, it has to be viable, and crucially, what happens after you have removed him? After the 91 conflict, many people were critical of George Bush and I for stopping. I think they now know why we stopped.
George Bush the first.
George Bush Senior. I think they now know why we stopped. It would have been illegal to go on, and the moment you go on, you have to run the country.
But do you believe, knowing what you know now, and what we seem to understand from the Chilcot Inquiry, that potentially this war, this time, was illegal?
I don't know. I'm not going to make that charge. I'm not a lawyer, and I can't make that charge. But I think if you're to restore trust in politics, we do need that to be addressed and to be responded properly.
Do you think it is at least possible, then, that Tony Blair misled the nation deliberately when he took us to war?
I'm not going to let you put words like that in my mouth. There's an inquiry, and they must decide what actually happened. If I may put it this way, I don't know what I don't know. The then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, may have known things that I don't know, which may make many things that seem curious fully understandable. What I do think is not understandable, the argument that Saddam Hussein was a bad man and therefore must be removed, simply won't do. There are many bad men around the world who run countries, and we don't topple them. And indeed, in earlier years, we had actually supported Saddam when he was fighting against Iran. So the argument that someone is a bad man is an inadequate argument for war, and certainly an inadequate and unacceptable argument for regime change.
Can I just finish